Morning, Chris.
Good morning. That quieted everyone down.
Counselor, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
John, while I'm thinking of it, did you see the email I forwarded you this morning about the delivery delay?
The what delay?
Delivery delay. I had sent an email to you, Chris, Jim, and Mike Gavin from the Berkshire Mall yesterday confirming our meeting time. And for whatever reason, the one I sent to you came back as delayed delivery.
Right.
So we're scheduled for September 10th at 11 a.m.
Hey, could I have a pen, please? And a paper. Okay, I'll write that down.
I was going to mention it under miscellaneous.
Oh, you're having a meeting with the mall?
Yes.
Oh, great.
Let's
We don't
hope
know
so.
that yet, Bill.
Didn't know you were interested in that, Bill.
Oh, I just started, you know. Let me get out my soapbox.
So are we waiting for anybody else?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Okay, let's call the meeting to order. Are there any other public comments? Okay, hearing none. Hey, just as information, I'm getting a new roof here in Maryland. So if you're hearing nails and staples, that's what it is. Anyway, hearing no public comment, we'll move on to the revised draft overlay zoning district regulations, which Chris did a great job last month. Was that at Economic Development or Planning Commission? It was Economic Development, right?
Yeah, I think it was right here, yes.
You know, he went over it pretty well. I don't know if anybody else has anything to add, subtract, or any comments. Speak up.
We have made some additional changes, John, and I wanted to highlight those for the committee. You know, after the last version that I presented to the committee a month ago was, you know, after we talked about it, Michelle shared it with George Haynes to see what he thought of the changes that I had made. And he had some additional suggestions. And, you know, I gotta say, I think George has been very engaged in our process to try to come up with some new regulations to create incentives for development. And he really does dial down to the details and gives us very thoughtful feedback. So I'm appreciative to George for his input. And, you know, what Michelle and I have discussed is to try to continue to integrate George's comments to the extent that we think that we can do that and that they're appropriate. So one of the things that he had raised was that it may be desirable for certain projects to have under the building parking where a structure is elevated by what he called podium supports, and I'm going to use the same term that he did. And as an example in the borough, I think of, I guess is the Loomis building where you know, the building is elevated so you can have ground level parking, but it's not technically a parking garage. It's a structure that's elevated by columns or podium, and then you have ground level parking. So what he had asked for is clarification in the ordinance that ground level parking under a podium supported structure would be considered structured parking for purposes of the incentives that are in this ordinance. Michelle and I are recommending that that be added to the ordinance, and in the version of the ordinance that Melissa distributed to you, that change has been added to the ordinance. So in addition to the definition of, considering ground level paved parking under a podium supported structure to be considered structured parking, there's also regulations where there are paved area limitations on the different redevelopment areas. That is a sort of traditional, typical zoning regulation to have limits on the paved area. And excuse me, what George had requested is that we consider adding a regulation that says that paved parking under a podium supported structure shall not count against your paved area limitation. Now, it seems logical to me to do that because it's under the building, but unless we put it in black and white, there could be a question about that. And so, with George's request and discussion with Michelle, we've added some clarification in the paved area limitation portion of the ordinance to clarify that where you have that paved parking at the ground level under a building, it won't be considered paved area for the limitation regulation. And the other change that he had requested was to squeeze a little bit harder on the off-street parking requirement for office uses. And he said, with the kind of urbanized building concept that is the, essential to what is the character of the development that we are seeking to attract with this ordinance, that he thinks it would be appropriate to be a little more, have a little bit less of a requirement for off-street parking. So what we have come up with would be, instead of one space for every 250 square feet of office, one space for each 350 square feet of office. Again, as I say, that makes it a little more challenging for meeting off-street parking requirements, from a user standpoint, but from a developer standpoint, it reduces costs, gives more options for the development of the property, and is consistent with some of the other concepts we already have in the off-street parking. Like, we are really trying to minimize the off-street parking for apartment uses, because again, we're trying to be really tight with the parking and give the developer the opportunity to have greater density. So those are all the changes. And I wanted, John started off before I made this presentation to say, does anybody have any questions or comments? And I wanted to just throw out there that there are some additional revisions that are in the document that's in front of you today. And I wanted to make sure that you had the opportunity to give comments or questions about those additional changes. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Chris. You got to help me out here. What is an office? Do they exist anymore?
Well, we'll see. We'll see. Time will tell. And my office looks a lot like my dining room.
Chris, for all intents and purposes, is a cubicle considered an office or just an actual structured four walls?
Well, an office is a use for zoning purposes. So it's whatever, so if I have a restaurant and I have an office at the back of the restaurant, the building is still considered to be used as a restaurant. The office portion of it is accessory to the restaurant use. If I have a whole building where the majority use is could be cubicles, could be individual offices, but it's, essentially people working phones at a desk. That's an office use, but it could still have, could have a cafeteria for workers and, other accessory type uses. So it's really the majority use. So cubicle, to me, is not a zoning thing. It's what's happening in the cubicle.
Oh.
So if somebody's sitting at a desk making phone calls and reviewing papers, that's an office use, whether it's in a cubicle or it's in an open floor or if it's in a closed office.
Thank you.
Chris or Michelle, was the intent of the original limitation on the amount of area that can be paved at a building, was that intended for groundwater runoff or for engineering purposes?
Partially that, and partially because, are you talking within the overlay or within the zoning ordinance in general?
Just in the zoning ordinance in general, was that the original intent for the limitation?
It's partially that, and I mean, partially because you also want to allow consideration for, if you're carving up 100% of a property, you want so much for building coverage, and then you're taking into consideration your setbacks, so much for paving coverage, so much for open space. So, I mean, when you're making regulations, you need to look at what's your use, considering that use, whether it's residential or commercial or industrial, how do you want to see those lots broken up in terms of putting together the mix of your building size, and again, taking into account your setbacks, how much parking is required for that. So how much in theory, based off your building size, would you need for paved area to accommodate parking, walkways, dumpster pad, access aisles, driveways, things like that.
My only comment was that if part of that is because of groundwater runoff, I'm not sure how you can exclude the paved areas. If it's not the groundwater runoff issue, then it doesn't matter. But if it's an engineering issue, then I'm not sure how you can exclude that, especially if it's real large and you take up a huge amount of paved area.
We would consider it part of the building coverage rather than paved area. So it'll still be taken into account for stormwater management, but it'll be under building coverage.
Well, that seems to make sense to me.
Well, actually, no, I stand corrected. And Michelle, I should have not jumped over you. Because we do also have exclusion from the building coverage limitation for structured parking, because we're trying to, again, encourage or promote that. But I guess to your question about stormwater, there's no way that we can do anything in the zoning ordinance that will relieve the responsibility of a developer to meet the stormwater management regulations. We're bound by the state law to enforce stormwater management regulations. So no matter what these percentages are, the project still has to meet stormwater performance requirements.
Okay, does anybody have anything else to add?
I have a question, John, if I might.
Sure.
If this is going to permit pillared garage type parking, if the building is sprinklered, does the area that is a part of the parking, does it have to be sprinklered also?
I believe so, yes. That's a question that falls under the building code, which I don't enforce, so I can confirm the answer. But just thinking of other structured parking areas like that and how they're constructed, having sprinkler systems, I would think they'd have to.
I would think so too, but I didn't know. And theoretically, you could have a completely pillared building and parking under the whole thing, couldn't you?
Yes, you could.
Well, I would think it would have to be sprinkled. It's just a question to keep in mind.
It's also not much, it's really not much different than the indoor parking on the lowest level at Wyomissing Square.
Which is sprinklered.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, from memory, whenever I'm in a parking garage, if there's a structure attached to it, I think it's always sprinklered. I don't know if it's a standalone parking garage with no occupied space. I'm not sure if those are sprinklered. But Michelle can certainly get an answer to that question.
Okay,
Yeah, and I mean, all I can tell you is if the building code would require it, yes, they'd have to install it. If the building code doesn't require it, our hands are tied by state law that we can't force them to put it in.
Yes, we know that by experience.
Yes.
okay, thank you.
Anybody else? So Chris, are we looking for a motion to send this to the planning commission or send it to borough council or?
Well, my recommendation would be to send it to planning commission. What do you think, Michelle? Did you have a process in mind?
It's already on the agenda for Monday's meeting, so yes.
Okay.
So then I'll make that motion that we approve the ordinance as written.
Okay, we have a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Any further discussion? Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, so we'll get at it on Monday at the planning commission. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks for the clarification there, Chris. It's good to know anyway. Do we want to get into the bike situation here, Michelle?
The bike situation with Movotics.
Well, bike share station update.
So I had a call with Courtney Dixon from Tower Health and Aaron Gantz last week, the week before that. I think it was last week. Sorry, they're blending together. Tower Health, I mean, one of the questions that came up as the three of us were brainstorming is if we would get multiple regional users. So say Tower Health, the borough of Wyomissing and West Reading together, Alvernia signs on, you know, the 18th Wonder signs on, maybe the Doubletree signs on, and we start creating this regional network. Would there be cost savings to everyone if we set it up under one user contract and each individual user underneath that was part of the network was billed by, you know, one parent host, for lack of a better description? My concern with that, because Courtney was offering for Tower to be the parent host of the contract and then basically invoice all of the users monthly. My concern with that is not only because of grant money that we're using for this, our internal processes, and, you know, also if at the end of 2 years, when our grant funding dries up, do we, you know, we're gonna have to make a decision. Do we want to continue to keep the bike shares? Is it revenue neutral? I don't know that I would recommend doing that, but I still wanted to run it through the committee just to let you know that was something that we talked about. Otherwise, Tower Health is, you know, on board. They're effectively ready to sign a contract with Movotics. You know, Courtney's aware that I have approval from this committee and from council to move forward with a contract as well once Tower Health signs on. The other thing we were looking at is trying to pinpoint locations outside of West Reading and Wyomissing within a half-mile to 3/4 of a mile radius from each other that would make sense. So, you know, like the RAC campus, the Alvernia campus in downtown Reading, potentially the Alvernia campus in Kenhurst, the Doubletree further up Penn Street, and then kind of spreading out from there over time. Now, those stations would all be the responsibility of the city of Reading or private stakeholders. That's where Erin Gantz comes in. She's going to start talking to private stakeholders to see if they'd be interested in sponsoring and setting up their own bike share station under this regional network. So from the people we've talked to, either, you know, business owners or property owners, there seems to be a lot of interest. I was at the 18th Wonder walking tour last Thursday morning and got to talk to Lucine Shelnick, who's one of the City of Reading council members. She's excited about the possibility of this happening. It's something that's going to come up the Reading Berks County 2030 Economic Strategic Plan that's further on the agenda. Transportation for underserved communities such as the city of Reading, where there's limited public transportation access other than BARDA, needs for additional types of transportation. The county sees the importance of that. The city sees the importance of that. So we're hoping we can start small and then grow and expand over the next couple of years.
So do these other entities, do they have the resources, the money to fund this project in perpetuity?
I don't know that anybody has a magic crystal ball to look into right now to see what their revenue streams are going to look like in 5-10 years. And right now it's more of a, let's attempt to get this off the ground and up and running and see if it actually works. I mean, if the data reports that we can pull from Mobotics show over the course of 2 years, it's not getting used, at a level that justifies keeping it, I don't think anyone outside of maybe Tower Health and Alvernia for their own employee and student needs would consider keeping them. But, private business looking at a perk or amenity they could offer an employee or a student versus municipal or nonprofit organizations that aren't, we don't have pots of money that we can just throw at things that aren't really getting used. Those are different scenarios. So, I mean, I can't speak to, say, the 18th Wonder or the city of Reading. I think Tower Health will keep theirs in perpetuity. I think, Ducom, that Equus is going to put a station in front of, will probably keep theirs in perpetuity. I could see Alvernia keeping theirs in perpetuity. The rest of us, there's too much unknown yet.
Yeah, you talk about what could happen in 5 years. We don't know what's going to happen in 5 months.
Is the contract an annual contract?
In this case, because we know we have grant funding for 2 years, it would be a 2-year contract, but we don't have to provide payment up front and in full. Kelly from Mobotics, we've had extensive discussion about that, just because Tower Health actually got lucky when Zagster went out of business. You could have had 5 years left on your contract with them and had paid in full, and you weren't getting any money back. Tower Health luckily only had a month and a half left in their contract. So they really didn't lose any money when Zagster closed, but Mobotics is sensitive to the fact that new users signing on are a little gun shy because that happened. So she's like, we can invoice you however you want. If you want it monthly, if you want it quarterly, if you want it annually, we don't expect you to give us some giant lump sum of money up front because of past history and people being a little gun shy. So my recommendation would be that we do just a monthly invoice.
Okay.
All right. So who do you deal with at Tower, Michelle?
Courtney Dixon.
Courtney, right. Okay. I've never met her, but anyway, if she's the one calling the shots, that's perfect. So do we, anything else on that, or can we move on to the economic strategic plan for Berks?
We can move on.
Okay.
I was asked by Paul Jansen to serve on the Reading Berks County 2030 Economic Strategic Plan. We had our first meeting August 10th, which the minutes were sent out to you when Melissa sent out the agenda. We had a second meeting of the committee, the technical committee as a whole, this past Monday. In between those two meetings, at the first meeting, we were broken up into research, stakeholders, RFP, and vision statement groups. I'm on the research group, along with Jamal Abadalo from the city of Reading, Frank Demkowski from the city of Reading, Scott Case, who actually wears a bunch of hats for the city of Reading, Tim Daly from Habitat for Humanity, and then Ashley from the County Planning Commission. What we're tasked with is looking through existing plans and studies that are out there, not just statewide. We're actually looking at studies from, excuse me, Houston, Colorado, California, to pull together studies that we like, what the RFPs included when those were put out, what the studies included. The goal of this plan is to come up with an actual working document that both the city of Reading and the county as a whole are in line on and are not working against each other, to identify whether it's workforce development, education, housing, transportation, economic development strategies, all of these components of the plan that will come together to lay a foundation and blueprint for what the county and the city can do in conjunction to foster economic development for the next 10 years. We have a pretty tight deadline. They want the RFP for this to go out roughly by the end of the year. And it looks like they're proposing 2 consultants, one that's more local, that can be on the ground, come and actually meet with stakeholders, meet with the committee members themselves, and then one that's potentially national that can pull from a broader pool of information and looking at what other cities throughout the country are doing. So our next meeting is a week from this coming Monday. We'll continue to meet every 2 weeks through the end of September. Once the RFP starts getting pulled together, the stakeholders, there's a separate stakeholders group besides the one that's called out here in the minutes. They will start meeting to also give input to the RFP, and then we will come together as a whole right before the RFP goes out, and the RFP will go out and we'll see what comes in.
That sounds like a good plan.
I will continue to send this group, the Economic Development Committee, the bi-weekly meeting minutes if you're interested in seeing them. But I also don't want to flood your email with something you're not going to read.
No, I'd be interested in seeing it to see how it's progressing.
Okay.
Michelle,
Well, I think you could probably, in my opinion, you could just bring us up to date at our Economic Development Committee meetings, and I don't need to read the minutes, to tell you the truth.
I can do either or both.
Well, if Bill wants the minutes,
No, I'm fine with just Michelle bringing us up to date too. That's fine.
okay.
Chris, did you have a question?
yeah, who's funding this process?
The county and the Greater Reading Chamber Alliance.
Hmm.
And I did bring up the call on Monday, which both Commissioner Leinbach and Commissioner Barnhart were a part of. I did bring up that, you know, at some point we need to look at tax assessment and reassessment. The county, Ashley from the county brought that up, Jamal brought that up. I mean, there were several of us that chimed in that in working with developers, one of the things we've heard loud and clear is that doing any type of development project here is challenging when looking at the surrounding counties because of the difference in taxes and because an assessment has not been done so long countywide in Berks County specifically.
So what was their reaction?
They didn't really have one. I mean, Christian and Kevin, I know, have both heard it multiple times before. I was told that Christian is in favor of a reassessment. I don't know if that's true or not. John, you know, I mean, you were part of that meeting with Kevin and George from Equus.
Yeah.
So, I mean, 2 of the 3 county commissioners have heard it from multiple sources, and you know, I believe at least 2 of them are potentially in favor of doing it. It's a question, I think, of funding and timing.
Well, the timing I don't know how much longer it can go in the first place, and the funding, it is what it is. So
I believe it's about 6 million is what it is.
Well, what's the county's budget? Something like 300 million?
Yes, I'm sure theirs was impacted by COVID just like ours was.
Right. Well, anyway, that would be nice if they would get on that project. And Chris mentioned it before, it's probably going to take a court order to get it done.
Yeah, that's my suspicion, that they just won't do it voluntarily because of the political consequences.
Right. Well, the political consequences diminish if they would do it now because they're not up for re-election for 3 years, but that's beside the point. How about anything else on that, Michelle, or anybody else have any questions for Michelle? Okay, miscellaneous. Hey, Fred, are you still there? Fred?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Hey, you had a meeting about the train the other day, and Michelle told me about it and said, would you like to go? And I said, hey, Fred knows more about trains by accident than I do on purpose. Just let him go. Could you tell us what happened there?
Well, it went well. I mean, as I mentioned before, the train study has been completed pretty much, and everything looks very favorable toward being able to get it done, perhaps as early as 2025, which is lightning speed these days. The problem is that there has been talk about stopping at 7th and Franklin in Reading and not coming over to Wyomissing. And I've fought that very strongly. And I've spoken to Tower. Tower is actually not interested in the train if it doesn't come over to Wyomissing, so that's a big deal part of it. But in any event, I've been arguing that we need to get to Wyomissing. So I was asked to, well, where would we put a station and so on and so forth. So Michelle arranged a meeting for me and George and Kevin from Equus, and we talked about it. And we pretty much concluded that the best spot would be the existing powerhouse. As we all know, there's an easement over the railroad tracks that was established by VF years ago to put a bridge over, and then it never happened because of costs and whatnot. But the easement exists. Norfolk is very antsy about bridges being added over their tracks, and it'll be a fight to try to put something new in. Not to say it couldn't be done, but it'll be difficult. But with the existing easement and knowing the costs involved, our plan is to do just a pedestrian thing from the Penn Avenue side over to the power plant building. Have to install elevators or whatever to get down, and then improve the existing vehicle bridge that's already on the north side. Equus feels that they can accomplish both of those things at a acceptable kind of cost. So the plan would be to use that and create parking and whatnot. That would accomplish most of what we want to be able to get the two sides tied together and, of course, a station. I also asked them whether they would be willing to consider actually building it and leasing it to the system as opposed to the expense of acquiring things. And they indicated that they'd be glad to look at that. They think it could be done, but a lot of things have to yet be determined. But I've reported back to the task force for the train that's what we came up with. That seemed to be okay, good. I asked George if we could get some kind of a rendering that, pictures tell a lot more than talking about it. He said we could. So hopefully we'll get that and then we can distribute that or whatever, but it looks very promising. So it was a good meeting. They're very enthusiastic about the thing, and Tower is entirely enthusiastic about it. So it went well.
That's great. I shouldn't have to say this, but thank you for keeping on top of this project for, 10 years, 20 years. How long, Fred?
It's been way too long. I've been worried for a long time that somebody would say, maybe it's time we get other people to do this. You're taking too long. But thank you. I'm glad to do it, and I think it's important for all of Berks County, not just for us.
Fred, may I ask a question?
Sure.
The access over the old existing bridge from the parking lot by the Telflex company to the power plant. That's a pretty old structure, but it only crosses the belt line, I think. Am I right?
Yes.
Okay. Since the train would be coming into Franklin Street, does Norfolk Southern have a preference as to what trackage would be used to reach
Yeah,
Wyomissing?
we want to keep it. We want to keep it on the line that the old original line, I guess you could call it, that runs directly into the city over the bridge there by, West Reading.
It used to go to the outer station.
Yeah, right, and it still does. I mean, that's now the Reading Public Works building and stuff. So the train would go from 7th and Franklin out to that facility and then bear off and come over toward us. There's plenty of traffic on that line, but nowhere near as much as on the belt line. So we'd want to take advantage of that, and it also take advantage of the fact that the building's already there, and we think it could be a neat use for the existing structure.
It very definitely could be, except that doesn't access the main line. That accesses only the belt line.
Now the belt line breaks off on the west side of the Park Road Bridge, so therefore the power plant is on the so-called island and can access both. We would get at it from the parking from the north side via the old bridge being upgraded, and build this pedestrian-only bridge from the Penn Avenue side over the other line to the power station.
Okay, ancient history. The old Wyomissing station used to be along the main line now.
It used to be where,
Yeah.
Dave?
Right along the main line, right opposite the old Vanity Fair or the UGI building.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Right, kind of underneath the Park Road Bridge, as it was Van Reed Bridge at that time.
Yeah, this would be a little bit further east than that, but yes.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Anything else, Fred, on the train?
Well, we're going to keep plugging, but there seems to be a lot of enthusiasm. The task force is in the process of meeting with federal officials, have met with Congresswoman Houlihan. They've got some other meetings scheduled with with Dan Muser, as well as Toomey and Casey. We've already spoken at length with some of the state level people, but that will be furthered as well. So it's plugging along, but they are not me. I'm the optimist, but I've been told by the consultants that they feel this can be done by 2025, which is extraordinarily quick.
They'd have to, Norfolk Southern would have to improve the trackage between the outer, well, actually from Franklin Street out, because that trackage is in bad shape.
Well, there's a speed limit on it as a result. So yes, you're correct about that. But there's going to be improvements made all the way to Philadelphia. There's things that have to be done to be able to get the freight and passenger trains around each other, and upgrading signals, and there's a lot of stuff. There's $350 million to be spent, but money's an object for everybody, as we've talked earlier in this meeting. I want to make sure that we're positioned that as the monies begin to happen again, as the economy reopens and we get past this pandemic, that we're at the front of the line, not just starting at the back of the line. So we want to be ready to go. There's going to be federal and state involvement. We think with the concept now of being able to access Amtrak through 30th Street in Philly to go north and south, that the rates that can be charged are now able to actually carry this thing, that there wouldn't be a need for that local subsidy, which was another dark mark for the county. So we think we can avoid that. I mean, it seems to be coming together. So let's just stay optimistic and keep the goal in mind.
Sounds good.
Thank you. Hey, Michelle, could you comment on this upcoming meeting with the Berkshire Mall people, and what's your take on it?
Sure. So I was contacted by Mike Gavin, who was the attorney for the new ownership of the mall. The mall wants to subdivide off the anchor stores, which would be very hard for the borough to approve because it would create a whole host of zoning issues that would require multiple variances from the zoning hearing board that I don't see them granting, not only because they'd be setting a precedent, but also just the sheer volume of variances that would be required. In having that conversation with Mr. Gavin, I explained to him that the mall was included when we revised the overlay, the existing commercial and industrial overlay district requirements roughly 2 years ago, that the borough, both this committee and council, have long been concerned about the demise of the mall, what the future of the mall looks like, and that, we're open to talk about things that they potentially are interested in doing and how we could work with them. Because of things that Mr. Gavin cannot say in public meetings, I suggested that we set up a meeting with myself, Chris, Jim McCarthy, and John as the chair of this committee, the planning commission, and a borough council member, to be able to discuss a little bit more openly what the mall wants to do long term, and throw out ideas of how we may be able to work with them. So that meeting is going to be held Thursday, September 10th at 11 a.m. at Happy Hollow under the pavilion.
Okay. That should be interesting. You're not interested, are you, Bill?
Hey, if they want to work with us and be a good neighbor, we can work with them.
Yeah. Yeah, at least we're talking. That's a good thing.
Yeah.
Well, Mike made that same point, that as much as we're concerned about the future of the property, obviously the ownership is too, in that if whatever they do fails, it not only fails for the community, it fails for them in terms of being financially viable and successful. So that was somewhat reassuring.
Yeah. Well, we'll find out.
Is the discussion on pad sites going to come up again?
I don't believe so.
Because weren't they asking for that as well?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Oh, I thought I had heard that they were interested in the borough approving some pad sites. Okay.
Well, we'll let everybody know next month once we have the meeting.
The things I want to understand from this meeting is why, from a business standpoint, it is desirable to subdivide off those anchor stores. It is possible by doing a condominium declaration to create separate legal units that are, in practical effect, in my opinion, the same as a subdivided lot, but it doesn't require borough approval because it's not considered a subdivision. But what we've heard, or what Michelle has heard, is that they're not interested in doing a condominium. They want to do an actual subdivision. And I'm really curious from a business standpoint why that makes a difference. So that's one of the questions that I'm going to have at this meeting. And I don't know, Michelle, they didn't provide any answer to that question, I don't think, to you. They just said they have a strong preference.
He said that the national retailers they're working with don't want, they won't accept a condo. They want an actual subdivided piece of land that is theirs. And beyond that, he didn't give any further explanation. Just everywhere that they've done this, when I made the point that for them to subdivide, they'd need, I think it was like 20 some variances. He said that they've done it in Jersey, that they, were willing to work with them. It was a similar situation. And I kind of took it tongue in cheek and said, well, that's fine. I just don't see our zoning hearing board being agreeable to doing that. I think the borough's perspective we'd much rather sit down and draft something specific to this property that we're not setting a precedent, but you're still able to accomplish your long-term goals for redeveloping the site.
Yeah. Well, with a subdivision, they still need to have a whole slew of cross easements, things like access, parking, utilities, stormwater. So it's still, the lots are still dependent on one another. And that's why I'm scratching my head trying to understand what the business reason is why a condo wouldn't achieve the same results that they're seeking. But anyway,
Find out in 2 weeks.
Yeah, right. It's something I'm very curious about.
Yeah, me too. Okay, is there anything else, Michelle, or anybody that wants to bring up?
I have nothing further.
Anybody else?
No.
Hearing nothing, the meeting is adjourned.
Hey, John?
Yeah.
I just wanted to comment that, it's a good thing you chair this committee because the way you're positioned right now, it looks like you have a big headdress on. That you're sitting on the throne with your king's crown on.
That's the king. He's one of vintage posters that Peggy stole from the spruce.
Oh.
Okay. Talk to you all later. Thank you.
Have a good day, all.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.